The Vanishing at Wakamatsu, A Ghost in the Machine. There's a particular kind of silence that settles over a home when its occupants are gone. It's not the quiet of sleep or the peaceful hush of an empty afternoon. It's a dead silence, an unnatural void where the rhythms of life, the creak of a floorboard, the hum of a refrigerator, the murmur of a television, are no longer background noise, but lonely echoes in a vacuum. This is the silence that, in the first week of May 2001, began to creep out from a modest two-story house in the Wakamatsu district of Chiba, Japan. A silence so profound, it would eventually be heard around the world. This is the story of Yasushi and Yoko Sano, a story that begins with the mundane rituals of domestic life and ends in an abyss of unanswered questions. It is a true story, and perhaps that is the most terrifying part of all. There are no monsters under the bed here. The horror lies in the simple, inexplicable fact that two people, in the heart of their own home, on an ordinary night, stepped out of their lives and into nothingness. Part 1. The Unanswered Call. The Golden Week holiday in Japan is a time of celebration and family. A string of national holidays creates a rare, extended break for the country's notoriously hardworking populace. In 2001, it was a time for travel, for visiting relatives, for rest. For Yoko Sano's elderly mother, it was a time to connect with her daughter. She had tried calling the Sano residence on May 3rd, and then again on the 4th. Each call was met with the same shrill, unanswered ringing. At first, it was a minor annoyance. Perhaps they were out enjoying the holiday. Yoko, 41, and her husband Yasushi, 44, were a quiet, stable couple. Yasushi was a respected executive at a food supply company, a man whose career was on a steady upward trajectory. Yoko was a dedicated homemaker, known for her gentle demeanor and her love for their two pets, a cherished corgi and a fluffy cat. They didn't have children, but their home was their sanctuary, their life a portrait of comfortable, middle-class stability in a peaceful suburban enclave of Chiba City, a sprawling port metropolis that bleeds into the greater Tokyo area. By May 5th, the annoyance had curdled into a knot of anxiety in the pit of her mother's stomach. It wasn't like Yoko to be unreachable for so long. She was diligent, always checking in. Another call. Ringing, 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 then silence. The mother's intuition, that primal, unignorable alarm bell, was screaming. On May 6th, she could bear it no longer. She traveled to the Sano's home in Wakamatsu. The neighborhood was a picture of Japanese suburbia. Neat houses packed closely together, manicured gardens, the quiet hum of a community at peace. The Sano home was no different, except for one unsettling detail. A light was on in an upstairs window, casting a pale, lonely glow against the gathering dusk. She approached the front door and called out her daughter's name. Yoko-san, Yasushi-san. Only one sound answered her. The frantic, desperate barking of their corgi from within the house. The barking was high-pitched, laced with a panic that went beyond a simple desire for a walk. It was the sound of an animal in deep distress. She tried the door. It was locked. She walked the perimeter of the house, peering into windows, her calls growing more urgent. The house remained a sealed box, a silent container holding a screaming dog and 1,000 questions. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Something was terribly wrong. She pulled out her phone and dialed 110, the emergency number for the police. When the Chiba Prefectural Police arrived, they confirmed what the mother already knew. The house was locked up tight. From the outside, it looked perfectly normal, save for the incessant barking and that single, unblinking light upstairs. With the mother's permission and a growing sense of foreboding, the officers made the decision to force entry. The click of the lock being picked was unnaturally loud in the evening quiet. The officer pushed the door open, and the first thing that hit them was the smell, the stale, close air of a house sealed for days, mingled with the unmistakable odor of animal waste. The corgi, ecstatic and terrified, scrambled towards them, whimpering. But it was the scene inside that froze the officers in the doorway. It was a tableau of interrupted life, a perfect snapshot of a moment that had been abruptly, violently paused. In the living room, the television was on, its screen emitting a silent bluish light, cycling through a forgotten program to an empty room. In the kitchen, a pot of stew sat on the stove, cold and congealed. Vegetables were laid out on a cutting board, half-chopped, a knife resting beside them as if the cook had just stepped away for a moment. On the table were two place settings, partially eaten meals still on the plates. It was as if the Sanos had been in the middle of their evening routine, making dinner, watching television, when they simply ceased to be. The officers moved through the house, their footsteps echoing in the unnatural quiet. Upstairs, they found the couple's bed neatly made. In the closet, their clothes hung in orderly rows. Critically, on a dresser lay Yasushi's wallet and Yoko's purse. Inside were their credit cards, identification, and a significant amount of cash, around 150,000 yen, roughly $1,200 at the time. People who plan to disappear take their money. They take their identities. The Sanos had left theirs behind as if they were of no more use to them. Their passports were also in their usual drawer. Their toothbrushes were in the bathroom. The cat was found hiding under a bed, traumatized but physically unharmed. The only things missing from this picture of domestic normalcy were Yasushi and Yoko Sano themselves, and their car, a silver Toyota Celsior, the Japanese domestic market equivalent of a Lexus LS 400. The police had walked into a ghost story. The house was not a crime scene in the traditional sense. There were no signs of a struggle. No overturned furniture, no broken glass, no bloodstains. The front door had been locked from the inside with a deadbolt, and the back door was similarly secured. It was as if the couple had locked up their home, set the stage for their own vanishing, and then somehow phased through the walls. The initial theory was a simple one, a domestic dispute that had spilled out of the house. Maybe they had a fight and stormed out together in the car to cool off, but that didn't explain the locked doors, or leaving the pets, or leaving their money. The scene screamed of an external force, a sudden, urgent departure. But how could an intruder get two adults out of a locked house without a single sign of violence or resistance? It made no sense. The investigators on the scene felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. They were standing at the edge of a mystery so clean, so perfect, it felt less like a crime and more like a magic trick. Part 2. The Ghost in the Machine. The investigation led by the 1st Investigation Division of the Chiba Prefectural Police, the unit tasked with the most serious crimes, began with a deep dive into the lives of the vanished couple. Who were Yasushi and Yoko Sano, and who or what would want them gone? Yasushi Sano, at 44, was the picture of a successful salaryman. He was an executive for a food-related trading company, a job that afforded him a comfortable lifestyle. He was described by colleagues as competent, serious, and perhaps a little reserved. Detectives meticulously combed through his professional life. Did the company have financial troubles? Was Yasushi involved in a shady deal? Had he made enemies? They interviewed his superiors, his subordinates, his business partners. The answer was a consistent, frustrating no. The company was stable. Yasushi's projects were all above board. He was well regarded, if not universally loved. There were no whispers of gambling debts, no secret mistresses, no hints of a double life. He was exactly what he appeared to be, a hardworking, middle-aged man providing a good life for his wife. He was, in a word, unremarkable, and in a missing persons case, a lack of remarkable features is a detective's worst nightmare. Yoko Sano, 41, was even more of an enigma, precisely because her life was so simple. Friends and neighbors described her as a kind, gentle soul, devoted to her husband and her pets. Her days were spent maintaining their immaculate home, gardening, and walking the corgi. She was the anchor of their quiet life. An investigation into her background revealed even less than her husband's. She had no known enemies, no secret sorrows, no hidden passions that might have led her to flee. Her mother was her closest confidant, and their relationship was strong. The idea that Yoko would willingly abandon her mother, and especially her beloved pets, leaving them to starve in a locked house, was not just unlikely. It was, to those who knew her, utterly impossible. Their marriage, by all accounts, was stable. There were no reports of loud arguments from neighbors, no tearful confessions to friends. They were a team, a unit. This only deepened the mystery. If they weren't running from each other, and they weren't running from their lives, then what had happened on the night of May 3rd? Investigators were left with a set of chillingly contradictory clues. The scene in the house suggested a sudden, unplanned interruption. The half-eaten dinner, the TV, the pets. This pointed to an external event, something that pulled them from their home against their will. And yet, the locked doors and lack of any forced entry suggested the opposite. It implied they had either left willingly or had allowed their abductors into the house. Who do you let into your home in the middle of dinner? A friend? A neighbor? A relative? Police investigated everyone in their inner circle. Everyone had an alibi. Every lead turned into a dead end. The most plausible theory, given the locked doors, was that someone had called them. A phone call with an urgent pretext. A family emergency. A problem at work. Something that would make them drop everything, lock up the house as best they could in their haste, and leave immediately. But again, who and why? Their phone records were pulled, but nothing stood out. Just the usual calls to family and friends in the days leading up to their disappearance. Days turned into weeks. The media caught wind of the story, and the Wakamatsu couple vanishing became a national sensation. The bizarre details captured the public imagination. It was a modern-day kamikakushi, a term from Japanese folklore for a sudden, mysterious disappearance, as if spirited away by the gods or demons. The Sano's home became a morbid tourist attraction. News vans lined the quiet residential street. The silence of the house was now replaced by the buzz of speculation. And then, just as the trail was growing ice cold, they got a break. A crucial piece of the puzzle had been found. Part 3. The Narita Riddle. On May 12th, 9 days after the Sanos were last thought to be seen, a security guard doing his rounds at a public parking lot near Narita International Airport noticed a silver Toyota Celsior. It had been parked in the same spot for over a week, long enough to be flagged. He ran the license plate. The car belonged to Yasushi Sano. The discovery sent a jolt through the investigation. Narita, the gateway to the world. The theory that the Sanos had planned their own disappearance. Fleeing the country was suddenly back on the table. Detectives rushed to the scene, their minds racing. Had the couple staged the entire thing? Was the scene at the house an elaborate piece of misdirection? The parking lot was a sprawling, impersonal place, one of thousands of concrete spaces, filled with the cars of travelers. The Sano's Celsior sat there innocuously, just another vehicle waiting for an owner who might be on the other side of the planet. But as the forensics team approached the car, the theory of a planned escape began to crumble, replaced by something far more sinister. The doors were locked. The investigators gained entry, and what they found inside was just as unnerving as the scene at the house. The car was pristine, clinically clean. There were no discarded papers, no food wrappers, no personal effects. It was as if it had just been detailed. Forensics dusted for fingerprints, but they found none. Not Yasushi's, not Yoko's, not anyone else's. The car had been meticulously wiped down, scrubbed clean of any and all evidence. This was not the work of a couple in a hurry to catch a flight. This was the work of someone who knew how to erase their tracks. This was professional. And then they found the most baffling clue of all. Sitting on the driver's seat, or by some accounts left in the ignition, was the car key. The implications were staggering. Whoever had driven the car to this lot had simply parked it, wiped it clean, and walked away, leaving the key behind. Why? A fleeing couple would take the key. A car thief would take the car. Leaving the key was an act of supreme indifference. It was a message. It said, "We are done with this. It is of no more consequence." The Narita discovery blew the case wide open, but it pointed in terrifying new directions. The police immediately checked the flight manifests for every plane that had departed from Narita between May 3rd and May 12th. They cross-referenced the names Yasushi Sano and Yoko Sano, as well as any known aliases. Nothing. They checked security camera footage from the airport terminals and the parking lot, but the technology in 2001 was a far cry from today's high-definition panopticon. The grainy footage yielded no clear images of who had parked the car, or if the Sanos had ever entered the airport at all. The car, which should have been their Rosetta Stone, was just another layer of enigma. It placed them on the doorstep of the wider world, only to show that they had never stepped through. They had been brought to the edge, and then they had vanished. With the hope of a simple runaway case now all but extinguished, the investigators were forced to confront three terrifying and increasingly plausible theories. Each was more chilling than the last. Part 4. Labyrinth of Nightmares. The investigation had reached a terrifying crossroads. The evidence didn't point to a single conclusion. It splintered, creating multiple, divergent paths into darkness. Each path was a different kind of nightmare. Nightmare Path 1, the Yakuza connection. This was the theory of a professional hit. In Japan, the specter of the Yakuza, the organized crime syndicates, looms large. Could Yasushi Sano, the respectable food executive, have gotten entangled with them? A business deal gone wrong, a loan that couldn't be repaid, an unintentional slight against the wrong person. The reasons could be myriad and opaque. This theory fit certain facts perfectly. The professionalism of the disappearance was the biggest tell. The Yakuza are known for their efficiency. They don't leave messy crime scenes. They don't leave bodies. They make people evaporate. The clinically clean car at Narita was a hallmark of a professional job. Wiping away fingerprints, erasing all traces, that was their signature. Driving the car to a public place and abandoning it was a classic move, designed to confuse and delay the investigation, buying the perpetrator's precious time. The police delved deeper into Yasushi's company, looking for any link, however tenuous, to known Yakuza fronts. They found nothing. No suspicious transactions, no rumored associations. Yasushi's life was, by all appearances, clean. But the underworld is an underworld for a reason. Its transactions are not recorded on company ledgers. Its threats are not made via email. They are whispered in back rooms, implied in handshakes, and enforced with silent, ruthless precision. Perhaps Yasushi had unknowingly crossed a line. Perhaps his company had disrupted a market secretly controlled by a syndicate. In this scenario, two men might have shown up at the Sano's door. Men who didn't need to break it down. Men who could be persuasive. Sano-san, there is a problem at the warehouse. The big boss needs to speak with you. Now. In this terrifying scenario, Yasushi, and perhaps Yoko as a witness or hostage, would have been escorted from their home. They would have been driven in their own car to a secluded location. What happened next is the stuff of grim speculation, a quiet execution, a burial in the vast, dense forests of the Chiba Peninsula, or a final, weighted journey to the bottom of Tokyo Bay. The car would then be driven to Narita, wiped and abandoned. A perfect crime. The only thing missing was a motive. Without it, this path remained a dark, unprovable suspicion. Nightmare Path 2, the personal grudge. If not organized crime, then perhaps disorganized crime. A crime of passion. This theory posited that the perpetrator was someone the Sanos knew and trusted. Someone with a hidden, burning grudge. This would explain the lack of forced entry. The Sanos would have willingly opened their door to this person. Perhaps they even invited them to share their dinner. The conversation might have been normal at first, before it veered into a dark, unforeseen territory. An old argument rekindled. A secret revealed. A demand for money. The crime would have had to be swift and silent. The killer, or killers, would have had to subdue two adults without alerting the neighbors in this tightly packed community. They would have had to force the couple into their own car and drive them away. This person would need to be both clever and ruthless, capable of staging the scene, driving the car to Narita, and meticulously cleaning it to remove all traces of themselves. The police explored this angle relentlessly. They re-interviewed every friend, relative, and colleague. They dug for secret lovers, for business rivals, for anyone with a reason to hate the Sanos. They found no one. The couple's life was a placid lake, and no matter how deep the investigators dredged, they couldn't find the monster lurking at the bottom. This theory carries its own unique brand of horror. It's the terror of the familiar mask, the idea that the person who destroyed you was not a shadowy mobster, but someone who had shared tea with you, someone you had smiled at, someone you had trusted. The thought that such violent hatred could fester behind a friendly face is, for many, more frightening than any gangster. But like the Yakuza theory, it remained pure speculation, a ghost without a face or a name. Nightmare Path 3, the unthinkable abduction. This is where the story veers from the realm of crime into the chilling territory of international espionage and state-sponsored terror. This is the theory of North Korean abduction. To an outsider, it sounds like something from a spy thriller, too outlandish to be real. But for Japan, especially in its coastal communities, it is a raw historical wound. From the 1970s through the 1980s, an unknown number of Japanese citizens were abducted from Japanese soil by North Korean agents. They were taken from beaches, from quiet streets, ordinary people who were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. They were kidnapped and taken to North Korea to be used as language and culture instructors for spies who would then be infiltrated back into Japan. The abductions were carried out with terrifying stealth and efficiency. Victims vanished without a trace. For decades, the Japanese government denied the claims, dismissing them as conspiracy theories, until 2002, when North Korea, in a shocking admission, confessed to abducting 13 Japanese citizens, 5 of whom were eventually returned. The true number is believed by many to be far higher. Could the Sanos have been victims of a renewed wave of abductions in 2001? Chiba is a coastal prefecture. The professionalism of the disappearance, the lack of struggle, the clean car, fits the profile of a state-sponsored intelligence operation. The agents would be highly trained. They could have used a pretext to lure the couple from their home, bundled them into their own car, and driven them not to Narita Airport, but to a secluded spot on the coast. There, a boat would be waiting in the dark waters, ready for a swift, untraceable journey to the Hermit Kingdom. The car would then be taken to the airport as a deliberate piece of disinformation, a red herring designed to send investigators on a wild goose chase, looking for people who flew away when they had actually sailed. This theory is the most horrific of all. It's the nightmare of being erased from your own life and forcibly transplanted into a hostile, alien world. To be alive, but to be lost forever. A prisoner in a country that is itself a prison. To live out your days as a tool for a foreign power. Your family never knowing if you are alive or dead. However, there were arguments against it. The Sanos were older than the typical abductees, who were often in their late teens or 20s. By 2001, North Korea's program was thought to have been curtailed due to increased international scrutiny. There was no political or intelligence reason to target this specific couple. It was the theory of last resort, the one investigators considered when all other logical explanations had failed. It was an admission that what happened to the Sanos might be beyond the normal scope of human crime and in the realm of something monstrous and political. Part 5. The Long Silence. Years passed. The Golden Week holiday came and went. Each year, a painful anniversary for Yoko Sano's mother. The investigation remained open, but it was no longer active. The case files grew thick, with reports that all led to the same place. Nowhere. The Sano's home was eventually sold. The light in the upstairs window went out for good. The quiet street moved on, but the story lingered, becoming a piece of local folklore, a cautionary tale whispered among neighbors. For the police, the case was a source of deep institutional frustration. It was a perfect crime, a locked-room mystery on a suburban scale. They had a beginning, the half-eaten meal, and an end, the clean car at Narita. But the entire middle of the story, the how and the why, was a complete and total blank. It was a ghost in their machine, a file that would never be closed. For the family, the passage of time brought no peace. The not knowing is a unique and terrible form of torture. A death can be mourned, a grave can be visited, but a disappearance is a wound that never closes. It leaves open the slimmest, most agonizing sliver of hope. A hope that one day the phone will ring, or a letter will arrive explaining everything. It is a hope that keeps the grief fresh, year after year. In 2011, 10 years after they vanished into the spring night, Yasushi and Yoko Sano were declared legally dead by the Japanese government. It was a bureaucratic necessity, a way to settle their estate, and provide a formal, if hollow, sense of closure. Their names were entered into the official records as deceased. But there was no body, no funeral, no final goodbye. They had been given a death certificate for a death that no one had ever witnessed. Today, more than 2 decades later, the vanishing at Wakamatsu remains one of Japan's most baffling unsolved mysteries. It has become a staple of true crime television shows and internet forums, where armchair detectives continue to debate the 3 nightmare paths. Was it the silent professionals of the Yakuza, the hidden rage of a trusted friend, or the unthinkable reach of a rogue state? Or was it something else entirely, something so strange and simple that everyone missed it? We are left with the chilling tableau that the police first discovered: the cold stew, the silent television, the frantic, loyal dog. These are the last known artifacts of the Sano's existence. They are the tangible proof of a life that was happening, right up until the second it wasn't. The ultimate horror of the Sano case is not in the speculation, but in the emptiness. It's a story about the terrifying fragility of our ordinary lives. It reminds us that the world we know, the routines we follow, the walls of the homes we believe are safe, can be breached in an instant, without a sound, without a trace. Yasushi and Yoko Sano locked their door one night and were swallowed by the silence. They became ghosts, not in their house, but in our collective memory. A permanent, terrifying question mark. And the silence they left behind is the only answer we will ever have. The girl who stepped into the summer night. There are stories that end, and then there are stories that simply stop. They don't conclude, they fracture, leaving behind a jagged edge that cuts anyone who comes too close. They become voids, black holes of narrative that swallow all light and leave only questions that echo in the dark. This is one of those stories. It's a story of a girl named Nana Sakuma, and the few short steps she took one summer evening that led her off the edge of the known world. Our story begins in a place of profound and deceptive normalcy, Funabashi, a city in the Chiba prefecture of Japan, a sprawling urban landscape that hums with the predictable rhythms of life. The year is 1991. The world feels big, full of possibilities, but for the residents of the Misaki-cho public housing complex, it is reassuringly small. Life is lived within a familiar radius. The walk to the train station, the trip to the local market, the evening visit to the neighborhood sento, or public bathhouse. It is a world of concrete and routine, of shared walls and the comforting knowledge that your neighbors are just a few feet away. It was in this world that 13-year-old Nana Sakuma lived. To understand the horror of what happened, you must first understand the peace that was shattered. Nana was a first-year junior high student, poised on that delicate threshold between childhood and the burgeoning complexities of teenage life. She was, by all accounts, a good daughter, a bright student, and a loyal friend. She had a round, gentle face, framed by dark hair cut into a practical style, and her smile in photographs is the kind of guileless, happy smile that belongs to a child who has never known real fear. Her life was a tapestry woven from simple threads: school, homework, friends, and family. The housing complex was her kingdom, a concrete castle where she was safe. Friday, August 23, 1991 began like any other late summer day in Japan. The air was a thick, wet blanket, heavy with a humidity that clung to the skin. The relentless, high-pitched drone of the cicadas, the sound of the Japanese summer, was a constant thrum against the windows of the Sakuma family's modest apartment. The sun had set, but the heat remained, trapped between the buildings. It was the kind of evening that demanded release, a cleansing of the day's sweat and grime. Inside the apartment, the small television flickered, casting a bluish glow across the room. Nana was home with her mother. Her father and older sister were out, leaving a quiet intimacy in the small space. It was a typical Friday evening, lazy and uneventful. Around 7 p.m., the phone rang, its shrill cry cutting through the chirp of the cicadas. It was one of Nana's friends. They chatted for a bit, the easy, meandering conversation of teenage girls. Nana's mother could overhear snippets of her daughter's side of the conversation. It ended with a promise. "I have to go now," Nana said, her voice clear and cheerful. "I'm going to the public bath with my mom. I'll call you back later." "I'll call you back later." 5 simple words. A promise of continuity. A statement that presumed a future. A later that was as certain as the sun rising tomorrow. It was the last time any of her friends would ever hear her voice. Around 7:40 p.m., Mrs. Sakuma gathered her things: a small towel, soap, a change of clothes. The Sento was a beloved ritual, a place of community and relaxation. It was also incredibly close. A 3-minute walk, no more. A short journey down the building's external staircase. A quick walk along a familiar, well-lit path. It was a distance so short it was almost an extension of their own home. "Nana, I'm going ahead," she called out. "Hurry and get ready. Meet me there." "Okay," came the reply from Nana's room. Mrs. Sakuma slipped on her sandals, pulled the apartment door closed behind her, leaving it unlocked, as one does when your daughter is just moments behind you, and descended into the warm, buzzing evening. She walked the familiar path, the light from the apartment windows of her neighbors making comforting patterns on the ground. She arrived at the Sento, paid her fee, and entered the steamy, welcoming warmth of the women's section. She found a spot, washed herself at the low faucets, and settled into the hot, soothing water, expecting the door to slide open at any moment to reveal her daughter. Minutes ticked by. The steam swirled, distorting the sounds of splashing water and quiet chatter. 5 minutes. 10. Mrs. Sakuma began to feel a small, familiar flicker of parental annoyance. Nana was probably dawdling, lost in a thought, watching the end of a TV show. She was a teenager, after all. Procrastination was part of the job description. 15 minutes. The annoyance began to curdle into something else. A faint prickling unease. This was unusual. Nana was a responsible girl. She had said she was coming right away. The path was short, safe. What could possibly be taking so long? Mrs. Sakuma got out of the bath, her skin red from the heat, and began to get dressed, her movements becoming quicker, more anxious. The relaxing steam of the bathhouse now felt oppressive, suffocating. By the time she left the Sento, it was around 8:30 p.m. The sky was now a deep, inky black, dotted with the orange glow of the city. The cicadas were still singing their maddening, monotonous song. As she walked back, a knot of dread tightened in her stomach. She scanned the path, the benches, the shadows between the buildings. There was no sign of Nana. She reached her apartment building and climbed the stairs, her heart beginning to pound a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She saw the front door. It was just as she had left it. Unlocked, ajar, ever so slightly. A cold wave of dread, far more chilling than the night air, washed over her. "Nana?" she called out, her voice trembling as she pushed the door open. Silence. The first thing she noticed was the television. It was still on, its silent, flickering images playing to an empty room. The blue light painted the walls in a ghostly pallor. The air in the apartment was still and heavy. It felt wrong. It was the silence of absence, a profound and terrifying emptiness where there should have been life. "Nana?" she called again, louder this time, a thread of panic weaving into her voice. She moved through the small living area and into her daughter's room. And that's when the true horror began to reveal itself. Not in what was there, but in what was not. Or rather, in what was still there. On Nana's desk, untouched, was her small purse. Inside, Mrs. Sakuma found 7,000 yen, a significant amount of pocket money for a 13-year-old. A runaway would have taken the money. On the floor, by her desk, was the small basket containing her bath supplies. Her soap, her shampoo, her towel, everything she would have needed for the Sento, everything she was supposed to have brought with her. A person planning to go somewhere takes things with them. A person running away takes things with them. Nana had taken nothing. Mrs. Sakuma's mind raced, trying to assemble the pieces into a picture that made sense. She had left. Nana had said she would follow, but she hadn't taken her money, she hadn't taken her bath things. A frantic inventory of the apartment yielded a single, chilling discovery. The only things missing from the apartment were Nana herself and the simple slip-on sandals she had been wearing. It was as if she had stood up from whatever she was doing, intending to leave for the 3-minute walk, and in the space between the front door of her apartment and the path outside, she had been erased, snatched from the world in a sliver of time so small it was almost imperceptible. Panic gave way to terror. Frantic phone calls were made, to her husband, to the police. The small apartment soon filled with the somber, heavy presence of uniformed officers. The routine of a Friday night had been irrevocably broken, replaced by the sterile, procedural nightmare of a missing person investigation. The police initially, as they often do, considered the possibility that Nana had run away. It was the simplest explanation, but it crumbled under the barest scrutiny. Why leave her money? Why tell her friend she was going to the bath and would call back? Why leave her bath kit behind? The theory didn't fit the facts. The facts pointed to something far more sinister. The investigation began to fan out from the apartment, a desperate search for a ghost. Officers combed the housing complex, their flashlights cutting sharp, nervous beams through the darkness. They knocked on doors, their questions echoing in the quiet hallways. Did you see anything? Did you hear anything unusual? And then, a break. A shard of light in the deepening darkness. A witness came forward. It was one of Nana's classmates, a girl who lived in the same complex. Her account sent a chill down the spine of the entire investigation. She told the police that around the time Nana would have been leaving her apartment, between 7:40 p.m. and 8 p.m., she had been near the base of the Sakuma's building, and she had seen something. She saw a girl who she was almost certain was Nana Sakuma. But she wasn't alone. Standing with her was a man. The description was vague, the kind of fleeting image a child might capture in the periphery. He was a stranger, somewhere in his 30s or 40s. He was of medium build, dressed in nondescript clothing. But it was the interaction that was so deeply unsettling. The classmate said it looked like the man was talking to Nana, and Nana seemed reluctant, uncomfortable. She wasn't shouting or fighting, but her body language suggested she did not want to be there. It was not the easy interaction of a family friend or a neighbor. It was something else, something coercive. This was the last known sighting of Nana Sakuma, a fleeting tableau of a young girl and a strange man, bathed in the twilight glow of a summer evening. After that moment, she vanished. The man became a phantom, a ghost who the police would hunt for years. They dubbed him the Shadow Man, a nameless, faceless figure who had emerged from the ordinary fabric of a Friday night to pluck a child from her life. Who was he? Was he a resident of the complex, hiding in plain sight? Was he an outsider who had been watching, waiting for an opportunity? The questions multiplied, but the answers remained buried with him, and with Nana. The days that followed her disappearance were a blur of organized chaos and mounting despair. The police launched one of the largest search operations in the history of Chiba Prefecture. Helicopters buzzed overhead, their rotors chopping the humid air. Divers plunged into the murky waters of nearby canals and rivers, searching for a body. Teams of officers, assisted by hundreds of local volunteers, fanned out through the city, combing through parks, abandoned buildings, and wooded areas. And everywhere, there was Nana's face. Her school photograph was reproduced on tens of thousands of flyers. Her gentle, smiling face was posted on telephone poles, in shop windows, at train stations. She smiled out from newspapers and television screens. Missing, Sakuma Nana, age 13. The image became a symbol of the city's collective fear. Every parent in Funabashi held their children a little closer. The short, safe walks to the store or the park were suddenly fraught with a new, terrifying potential. The Shadow Man wasn't just a threat to the Sakuma family. He was a boogeyman who now haunted the entire community. He was the embodiment of the predator who walks among us, unseen until it is too late. The investigation focused intensely on the housing complex. Police believe the abduction had to have been meticulously planned, or horrifically opportunistic. The window of time was minuscule, perhaps only 5 to 10 minutes. How could someone subdue and remove a 13-year-old girl from a bustling apartment complex in such a short time without anyone hearing a scream or seeing a struggle?
One theory was that the abductor was someone she knew, or at least recognized, someone whose presence wouldn't immediately raise an alarm. He could have called to her from the stairwell, perhaps, using a friendly pretense. "Your mother sent me to get you. Can you help me with something for a moment?" A moment's hesitation, a single step toward the stranger, and the trap would have been sprung. The unlocked door of her own home, which should have been a symbol of trust in her imminent return, instead became an accomplice to her disappearance. It represented a threshold she was meant to cross, but never did. Weeks turned into months. The massive, visible search operation began to wind down, replaced by the quiet, grinding work of detectives following up on dead-end tips. The media attention faded. The flyers, battered by wind and rain, began to peel from the telephone poles, Nana's smile fading with them. But for the Sakuma family, the nightmare never ended. Their apartment became a mausoleum, a shrine to a ghost. Nana's room was kept exactly as she had left it on that August evening. Her books on her desk, her clothes in her closet. The purse with its 7,000 yen and the basket of bath supplies remained, silent, damning testaments to the moment her life was interrupted. To move them would be to accept that she was never coming back. And so they waited. They lived in a home frozen in time, suspended in the amber of a single horrific moment, while the world outside moved on. Years passed. The cicadas of summer gave way to the crisp leaves of autumn, the cold of winter, and the blossoms of spring, over and over again. Each anniversary of her disappearance was a fresh wound. Each passing year made the hope of her return feel more and more like a fantasy. The police investigation grew cold, the files thick with reports but barren of conclusions. The Shadow Man remained, a ghost. In 2006, 15 years after Nana Sakuma stepped out to meet her mother, a quiet, bureaucratic event occurred that was, in its own way, as brutal as the abduction itself. The statute of limitations for kidnapping for ransom in Japan expired. Legally, the window for prosecuting her abductor had closed. It was a formal procedural death of hope. While the case technically remained open, it was now relegated to the cold case archives, a dusty file in a forgotten cabinet. What is the true nature of horror? Is it the monster you can see, the threat you can name, or is it the void, the absolute unending uncertainty, the not knowing? This is the horror that the Sakuma family was forced to inhabit. A fate, no matter how terrible, provides a resolution. It allows for grief, for mourning, for the slow, painful process of healing. But an absence offers none of that. It is a perpetual state of waiting for a door to open that never will. The story of Nana Sakuma became a part of the local folklore, a cautionary tale whispered from one generation to the next. Don't talk to strangers. Be home before dark. She ceased to be a person and became a lesson, a ghost story. But the truth is far more terrifying than any fiction. The horror isn't a ghoul or a demon, it's a man in nondescript clothing on a normal Friday night. It's the terrifying fragility of safety, the paper-thin wall between our normal, everyday world and a dark, predatory reality that exists just outside our door. Today, more than 3 decades have passed. Nana Sakuma would be a middle-aged woman. She might have a family of her own, a career, a life filled with the mundane joys and sorrows that make up a human existence. Instead, she is forever 13. She is forever frozen in that sliver of time, a girl in her summer sandals, standing on the threshold of her apartment, about to take a 3-minute walk into the warm, buzzing night. We are left only with the echoes. The echo of a cheerful voice on the phone. "I'll call you back later." The echo of a mother's call in an empty apartment. "Nana?" And the deafening, silent echo of the years that have followed. The story of Nana Sakuma doesn't have an ending. It has a question mark, hanging in the humid summer air of 1991. It asks us to look at the familiar spaces of our own lives, the short walk to the corner store, the path through the park, the unlocked front door, and wonder about the shadows that gather just at the edge of the light. It reminds us that sometimes people don't just die. Sometimes they simply vanish, leaving behind a hole in the world, a story without a final page,
and the terrifying, unending question: what happened in the dark?
The Crimson Predator of Gunma. The true story of the Tokyo Metropolitan murders. Prologue. A Whisper on the Wind. The year 1968 was a fulcrum in the history of modern Japan. The nation, having risen like a phoenix from the ashes of a devastating war, was now a titan of industry and innovation. Tokyo, its sprawling heart, pulsed with the energy of a million dreams. The upcoming 1970 World Expo in Osaka was a symbol of this rebirth, a promise of a future brimming with peace and prosperity. The air was thick with optimism, the scent of new concrete, and the hum of a society accelerating into modernity. But beneath the gleaming chrome and the neon glow, the old shadows lingered. In the quieter prefectures that orbited the great metropolis like sleeping moons, life moved at a different pace. One such place was Gunma, a land of mountains and silk farms, of hot springs and quiet, winding roads. It was a world away from the frantic pace of Tokyo, a place where doors were often left unlocked, and a neighbor's word was as good as a contract. It was considered safe. It was considered home. Yet, starting around that time, a new kind of whisper began to travel on the wind, a disquiet that had no name. It wasn't a headline or a police bulletin, not at first. It was the story of a friend whose daughter was late coming home, a rumor of a strange car seen idling near a high school, a fleeting sense of being watched on a lonely country road. These were the ephemeral anxieties of a society in transition, easily dismissed as overactive imaginations. No one yet knew that these whispers were the first faint tremors of an earthquake, a seismic event of human cruelty that would soon rupture the very soul of Gunma. No one knew that a predator was testing the waters, learning the roads and honing an appetite for terror. A monster was hiding in plain sight, his friendly smile a mask, his car a rolling coffin, and his heart a frozen, empty void. The age of innocence was ending, and its death would be painted in crimson. Part 1. The Artist's Cruel Canvas. By the spring of 1971, the whispers had grown into a palpable fear. The optimism of the new decade felt fragile, brittle. In the towns of Takasaki, Maebashi, and Fujioka, a strange and terrible pattern was beginning to emerge. A pattern the local police were tragically slow to recognize. It began not with a scream, but with silence. The first was Tsuru Abe, 17. She was a bright, diligent student with a part-time job at a candy factory. On March 31st, she finished her shift, waved goodbye to her coworkers, and walked toward the train station, her mind likely on homework and the simple pleasures of a teenage life. She never made it home. Her parents' frantic calls to her friends, to the factory, to the police, were met with shrugs and sympathetic but helpless words. She had simply vanished. A missing persons report was filed. A file was opened. A mother's heart began to break. Less than 2 weeks later, on April 13th, Mieko Oikawa, also 17, disappeared. She had told her family she was meeting a friend. She was last seen walking down a busy street in the late afternoon. Like Tsuru, she was swallowed by the world, leaving behind only a void of confusion and escalating panic. 2 teenage girls, gone without a trace, in the same small corner of Japan. Coincidence? The police hoped so. The families feared not. The community began to talk. Parents held their daughters tighter, issuing stern warnings about talking to strangers. A collective anxiety, cold and sharp, settled over Gunma. Who was taking their children, and why? The answer was cruising the prefectural roads in a gleaming maroon Toyota Corona Mark II. Behind the wheel sat a man who did not look like a monster. Kiyoshi Okubo, at 36, was handsome, even charismatic. He had a confident smile, a fashionable haircut, and a way with words that could put even the most hesitant young woman at ease. He was married, a father, a man who could blend seamlessly into the fabric of society. But Okubo was a fractured soul, a man whose charm was a carefully constructed lure. He had a history of sexual assault, a rap sheet that should have served as a permanent warning. But the justice system had released him, believing him rehabilitated. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. Okubo had cultivated a perfect modus operandi, a twisted piece of performance art. His prop was a sketchbook.
His role was that of an artist or a talent scout. He would spot his target, a young woman, often alone, waiting for a bus or walking home, and glide to a stop beside her. "Excuse me," he'd begin, his voice smooth and reassuring. "I couldn't help but notice you. I'm an artist. You have a very unique look, a classic beauty. Would you ever consider modeling for a painting? Or for the more ambitious girls? I'm a scout for a major studio in Tokyo. We're looking for fresh faces. You have exactly the kind of star quality we're searching for. I could arrange a screen test." In a Japan obsessed with Western fashion, art, and the burgeoning world of television and film, these were potent words. He was selling a dream. For a girl from a small town, it was a dizzying, intoxicating offer. A sudden, unexpected portal out of a mundane life and into a world of glamour and excitement. The interior of his car was clean, the seats plush. He gestured to the passenger side, his smile never faltering. "Just a short drive. We can discuss the details. I'll even pay you for your time, just for listening." For those who hesitated, he was patient. He'd show them his sketchbook, filled with surprisingly competent drawings of faces and landscapes. It was all part of the elaborate deception, the stagecraft of a predator. Once the car door clicked shut, the performance was over. The trap was sprung. The friendly smile would vanish, replaced by a cold, dead-eyed flatness. The smooth voice would harden. Any protest was met with a sudden, brutal show of force. The man who had looked like a savior a moment before was now a captor. He would drive, not to a studio or a scenic spot for a sketch, but to the remote, lonely places he knew so well. The dense forests, the overgrown riverbanks, the forgotten mountain roads of Gunma. There, in the suffocating silence of the wilderness, he would commit his horrific acts. He would rate them. And then, to silence them forever, he would wrap his hands around their throats and squeeze the life from them. He was not just a murderer. He was an annihilator of hope. He stole their lives, their futures, and their identities, burying them in shallow, unmarked graves, turning the beautiful Japanese countryside into his private, grotesque cemetery. On April 20th, he took Michiko Takeuchi, 19. On May 5th, Mitsue Akabori, 20. On May 10th, Toshie Ide, 20. The disappearances were no longer a whisper. They were a roar. The media descended on Gunma, splashing the faces of the missing girls across newspapers and television screens. They dubbed the unknown assailant the Tokyo Metropolitan Murderer, a slightly inaccurate name, as his hunting grounds were clearly Gunma, but it spoke to the fear that this evil could easily spill from the quiet prefecture into the nation's capital. The police were in a state of crisis. They had no witnesses, no forensic evidence, no leads. The separate municipal police forces of Gunma were struggling to coordinate, sharing information too slowly, failing to see the clear, terrifying link between the cases. They were hunting a ghost who drove a common model of car, a specter who left behind only grief and absence. The pressure was immense. The public was terrified, demanding action. Every day that passed without an arrest felt like a failure, and the police knew, with a certainty that chilled them to the bone, that the killer was still out there, cruising the roads, his sketchbook on the passenger seat, searching for the next face for his cruel canvas. Part 2, The Hunter and the Hunted. The terror reached its zenith in a terrifying 72-hour period in mid-May. Kiyoshi Okubo was a man possessed, his compulsions now running unchecked. He had tasted power and found it intoxicating. The fear he was generating in the press and the public only seemed to fuel his ego, his sense of invincibility. On May 12th, he abducted Akemi Yoshikoshi, 18. The next day, May 13th, it was Kazuyo Sato, 19. And then, on May 14th, he took his 8th and final murder victim, 21-year-old Reiko Takamura. 8 young women. He raced from the world in less than 2 months. The entire region was paralyzed by fear. Young women refused to walk alone. Fathers escorted their daughters to and from work and school. The roads of Gunma, once symbols of freedom and mobility, now seemed laced with menace. Every dark-colored sedan was a potential threat. every friendly stranger a possible monster. But Okubo, in his frenzied spree, was growing sloppy. He was high on his own notoriety, and his meticulous planning began to fray at the edges. Small mistakes, almost unnoticeable at first, were starting to accumulate. A witness near the scene of Reiko Takamura's abduction remembered seeing a girl get into a maroon Toyota Corona. She didn't get the full license plate, but she remembered a few of the numbers. Irimitsu. It wasn't much, but it was the first solid clue the police had. A car, a color, a partial plate. It was a crack of light in a seemingly endless dark. The investigation, which had been a scattered collection of desperate efforts, was finally centralized. A special task force was assembled, bringing together the best detectives from across the prefecture and from the Tokyo Metropolitan Police Department. The command center was a hive of frantic activity. Maps of Gunma covered the walls, dotted with pins marking the last known locations of the victims. Lists of missing persons reports were cross-referenced. The partial license plate number became their holy grail. They began the Herculean task of checking the registration of every single maroon Toyota Corona Mark II in the Kanto region. The list was thousands of names long. While the police waded through motor vehicle records, Kiyoshi Okubo was preparing to strike again. His confidence was absolute. He had outsmarted the authorities for weeks, had held an entire prefecture in his thrall. On May 19th, he swapped his now infamous maroon Corona for a new car, a light blue Toyota Corona, believing it would give him a fresh start, a new cover. That afternoon, he was driving through Fujioka when he saw her, a young woman, just 19 years old, walking alone. He pulled over, the familiar, practiced script ready on his lips.
He rolled down the window. "Excuse me, I'm an artist." The girl was wary. The stories were everywhere. But Okubo was persuasive. He was handsome, well-dressed, and his new car didn't match the description being whispered about. He spoke of fame, of art, of a world beyond her small town. Against her better judgment, she found herself believing him. She got in the car. It was a fatal mistake that, by some miracle, would not prove fatal. As soon as the door closed, Okubo's demeanor shifted. The mask fell. His eyes went cold. He didn't drive toward the city. He turned onto a secluded mountain road. The girl's blood ran cold. This was it. This was the man from the news. The dream he had sold her was a lie, and she was now trapped in a nightmare. Panic seized her, but it was quickly followed by a primal, desperate surge of adrenaline. She was not going to be another pin on a police map. As Okubo slowed to navigate a sharp, unpaved turn, she saw her chance. He was focused on the road, his grip on her momentarily relaxed. She didn't scream. She didn't plead. She acted. With all her strength, she threw her shoulder against the passenger door, fumbled for the handle, and launched herself from the moving car. She hit the gravel hard, the impact jarring her bones, tearing at her skin. She tumbled down a short, steep embankment, rocks and dirt scraping her raw. She could hear the squeal of brakes, the angry shout of Okubo. She didn't look back. Scrambling to her feet, ignoring the searing pain, she ran. She plunged into the thick woods that lined the road, branches whipping at her face, thorns tearing at her clothes. She ran with the terror-fueled strength of a hunted animal, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She could hear him behind her for a moment, crashing through the undergrowth, but the forest was her ally. It was dense, dark, and confusing. She was small and fast. He was not. She kept running until her lungs burned and her legs gave out, finally collapsing behind a thicket of bamboo, her body shaking uncontrollably. Listening to the sounds of the forest, praying he had given up. He had. Realizing he had lost her and risked exposure, an enraged Okubo returned to his car and fled. The girl, battered and bleeding but alive, eventually found her way back to a main road. She flagged down a passing car, her story tumbling out in a torrent of gasps and sobs. The police were called immediately. This was the break they had been praying for. They now had a survivor, a living witness who had seen his face, heard his voice, and escaped his grasp. She gave them a perfect, detailed description of Kiyoshi Okubo, and, most importantly, she gave them the license plate number of his new light blue Toyota. The name Kiyoshi Okubo was not unknown to law enforcement. His name was already on a long list of known sex offenders in the area. When they cross-referenced the survivor's description and the car registration with their list of priors, everything clicked into place with horrifying clarity. The partial plate from the maroon car, the detailed description from the survivor, the registration of the new blue car, it all pointed to one man. The ghost had a name. The hunt was no longer for a phantom. It was for Kiyoshi Okubo. The net, which had been cast so wide, was now closing in on a single, terrified prey. The hunter had become the hunted. Part 3. Unmasking the Monster. The final act of the drama unfolded with breathless speed. On May 23, 1971, armed with an arrest warrant and the certainty that they had their man, a team of detectives descended on the address registered to Kiyoshi Okubo. They found him not in some darkened hideout, but in a place of numbing normalcy. He was with his wife, shopping. The detectives approached him cautiously in the bustling public space. "Kiyoshi Okubo?" one of them asked, his voice calm but firm. Okubo turned. For a fleeting second, his face registered shock, a flicker of the cornered animal. But it was quickly replaced by a veneer of cool arrogance. He knew the game was up. There was no attempt to run, no denial. He simply nodded, a silent admission. The terror that had gripped Gunma for 54 days ended not with a shootout or a dramatic chase, but with a quiet, anticlimactic arrest amidst the mundane backdrop of everyday life. In the interrogation room, Okubo's composure remained unnervingly intact. He wasn't a ranting lunatic or a sobbing, remorseful wreck. He was calm, articulate, and chillingly matter-of-fact. Faced with the survivor's testimony and the evidence connecting him to the cars, he confessed. He confessed to everything. What followed was one of the most gruesome and heartbreaking chapters in the history of Japanese crime. Okubo agreed to lead the police to the bodies. For days, a grim procession wound its way through the beautiful scenic landscapes of Gunma, with Okubo in the lead car, calmly pointing out the locations of his secret burial sites. He directed them to a forested hillside, a secluded riverbank, a patch of overgrown wasteland. At each spot, he would get out of the car and indicate the precise location with a chilling detachment, as if pointing out a good place for a picnic. "She is here," he'd say, gesturing toward a patch of disturbed earth, about 1 meter down. The digging began. The work was slow, methodical, and soul-crushing. The detectives and forensic teams worked under the silent gaze of the mountains, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and unspeakable tragedy. One by one, they were found. Suryabe, Miyako Oikawa, Michiko Takeuchi, the 8 young women, whose hopeful faces had stared out from newspapers, were unearthed from their shallow graves. The discovery of each body was a fresh wave of horror and grief, not just for the families who now had their worst fears confirmed, but for the hardened investigators who had never witnessed such cold, systematic cruelty. Okubo watched the exhumations without a flicker of emotion. During his confession, he described the murders in meticulous, horrifying detail, recounting his methods, his victims' last words, and his efforts to conceal their bodies. He spoke of their deaths as if he were a mechanic describing a repair. There was no remorse, only a strange, narcissistic pride in the notoriety he had achieved. He saw himself not as a monster, but as a dark celebrity, the protagonist of his own horrific story. His only moments of emotion were flashes of anger when the media misspelled his name or got a detail of his crimes wrong. The trial of Kiyoshi Okubo was a national spectacle. The courtroom was packed with press and the grieving families of his victims. Throughout the proceedings, Okubo remained a portrait of detached arrogance. He listened to the litany of his crimes, to the gut-wrenching testimony of the families, and to the powerful account of the woman who had escaped him, all with the same impassive expression. The defense tried to argue for insanity,
a plea for a man with a split personality. But the prosecution painted a clear picture of a calculating, manipulative, and entirely sane predator who knew exactly what he was doing. His elaborate lures, his changing of cars, his careful disposal of the bodies. These were not the actions of a man detached from reality. They were the actions of a meticulous hunter. On February 22, 1973, the court found him guilty on all counts. 8 charges of murder, as well as multiple charges of rape, abduction, and assault. The judge, his voice heavy with the weight of the verdict, sentenced Kiyoshi Okubo to death by hanging. Okubo received the sentence without visible reaction. He spent the next 3 years on death row, appealing his sentence, a process that only prolonged the agony for the victims' families. His appeals were denied. On September 22, 1976, Kiyoshi Okubo was executed. The man who had brought a reign of terror to Gunma was gone. Epilogue: The Lingering Shadow. The execution of Kiyoshi Okubo brought a close to the legal case, but the story did not end there. The scars he left on the community were deep and permanent. The Tokyo Metropolitan murders became a dark landmark in the nation's consciousness, a brutal lesson in the nature of evil. The case shattered the post-war illusion of Japan's inherent safety, proving that monstrousness could lurk behind the most ordinary of faces, on the most familiar of roads. Police procedures were reformed. The case highlighted the critical need for better communication and data sharing between prefectural police forces, leading to the creation of more centralized systems for tracking violent criminals and connecting serial crimes. For the people of Gunma, the world was irrevocably changed. A generation of parents learned a new kind of fear. A generation of daughters grew up with warnings that their mothers had never needed. The name Okubo became a byword for evil, a boogeyman to frighten children, and a chilling reminder for adults. Today, the winding roads of Gunma are once again quiet. The mountains stand serene and majestic. The forests are lush and green. Life has moved on. A new generation walks those streets, largely unaware of the terror that once gripped their hometown. But for those who remember, the shadow of the Crimson Predator remains. It lingers in the back of the mind when a car slows down unexpectedly, in the slight hesitation before speaking to a stranger, in the memory of 8 young women whose dreams were stolen and buried in the cold, dark earth. Their names are a whisper on the wind, a permanent, sorrowful echo in the heart of a place that learned in 54 days of terror that the most horrifying monsters are the ones that are real. The Girl Who Walked into the Reed Marsh. Prologue: The Sound of Silence. In the vast, sprawling archives of human sorrow, there are stories that scream for attention, cases with brutal evidence, twisted confessions, and a clear, monstrous face to blame. They are the loud tragedies, the ones that make headlines and fuel documentaries. But there are other stories, the quiet ones. They don't scream, they whisper. They are the stories of empty spaces, a chair at the dinner table that will never be filled, a bicycle rusting in the rain, a bedroom kept as a perfect, heartbreaking shrine. These are the tales of vanishing, of lives that simply stop. They leave behind not a body, but a question mark so large it warps the reality of everyone it touches. It's a silence more deafening than any scream. This is one of those stories. It is the story of Zhao Lina, and the day in 1991 when the world as she knew it swallowed her whole. It begins not with a bang, but with the rustle of reeds in a marsh on the edge of a city hurtling toward the future. A city that, in its rush, forgot to look back at what it was leaving behind. Part 1. The City of Bicycles and Ghosts. Shanghai in 1991 was a city of contradictions, a place caught between two worlds. On one hand, there was the relentless thrum of progress. The skeletons of future skyscrapers clawed at the sky in Pudong, cranes swung like metallic dinosaurs, and the air, thick with coal smoke and the scent of river damp, was filled with the promise of a new China. It was a city of ambition, of concrete and steel, a place shedding its skin. But away from the nascent financial district, in the labyrinthine alleyways of the older Puchi side, the past clung on with stubborn fingers. Here, the dominant sound was not the roar of engines, but the gentle whirring of a million bicycle chains and the chiming of their bells. A river of humanity flowing through the streets. Life unfolded in the long tongs, the traditional lane houses where families lived stacked on top of one another, their lives interwoven with the intimacy of shared kitchens, communal gossip, and the ever-present gaze of neighbors.
It was in one of these long tongues, in a modest second-floor apartment that always smelled of star anise and mothballs, that Zhao Lina lived. At 13, Lina was herself a creature of contradictions. To the outside world, she was a ghost, long before she disappeared. Quiet, observant, with large, dark eyes that seemed to be looking at something just beyond your shoulder. She was the kind of child who could be in a room without you ever noticing her presence. Her school reports described her as introverted and daydreamer, words that frustrated her father, a pragmatic factory foreman named Zhao Wei, but were understood perfectly by her mother, Mei, and her grandmother, Nai Nai. They knew Lina's silence was not emptiness, it was fullness. Her inner world was a vibrant, chaotic landscape she furiously documented in a series of spiral-bound sketchbooks. She drew everything. The wizened face of the man who sold boiled eggs on their street corner, the intricate patterns of steam rising from a bowl of noodles, the way sunlight filtered through the leaves of the plane trees, dappling the pavement in shifting patterns. Her drawings were more than just copies of the world. They were interpretations, imbued with an eerie, knowing quality. A smiling face might have shadows in the eyes that hinted at a hidden sadness. A simple street scene might have an unnerving perspective, as if viewed from an impossible angle. Lina's father, a man of calloused hands and simple truths, didn't understand her art. Why draw such things, he'd ask, flipping through a book filled with gnarled tree roots and stray cats with knowing, almost human eyes. Draw a bicycle. Draw a building. Something useful. But Lina's sanctuary, the place that fueled her strange and beautiful imagination, was not the city. It was the vast, untamed reed marsh that bordered their district. In 1991, this marsh was a sprawling wilderness, a holdover from an older, wilder Shanghai. It was a liminal space, neither land nor water, stretching for miles along the Huangpu River's tributary. To the city planners, it was a nuisance, a patch of undeveloped real estate waiting to be tamed and paved over. To the local parents, it was a place of cautionary tales, of sucking mud and hidden currents. To Lina, it was magic. It was a world of towering green stalks that created a maze of whispering corridors. In the summer, the air was thick with the thrumming of cicadas and the metallic tang of dragonflies. In the fall, the reeds turned a brittle gold, and the wind moving through them sounded like 1,000 hushed conversations. Lina would spend hours there, her sketchbook in her lap, capturing the secret life of the marsh. She knew the paths that were safe and the ones that turned to treacherous mud. She knew which birds nested where, and she could identify the tracks of the small creatures that called the wilderness home. Her grandmother, Nai Nai, a woman whose mind was a treasure chest of old-world superstitions and folklore, was the only one who seemed to understand Lina's connection to the marsh, but also terrified her. "That place is not for children, Lina," she would say, her voice a low, raspy whisper as she shelled peas into a porcelain bowl. "It has a hungry spirit. The old ones say it remembers when it was all that was here, before the city. It doesn't like the noise. It doesn't like the change. Sometimes it takes things back." Lina would just smile, a secret, knowing smile that made her grandmother shiver. In her latest sketchbook, she had started drawing something new. Amidst the detailed renderings of herons and carp, a new figure began to emerge. At first, it was just a suggestion, a few long, thin lines hidden among the reeds, like a trick of the light. Then it became more defined, a tall, impossibly slender figure that seemed to be woven from the reeds themselves. It had no face, just a smooth, blank oval where features should be. Its limbs were elongated, jointed like bamboo stalks, and its fingers were like grasping roots. She never gave it a name. It was just the thing in the reeds. Her father never saw these drawings. She kept them in the back of the book, a secret between her and the marsh. On the morning of October 26, 1991, the air had the crisp, clean bite of late autumn. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue. It was a Saturday. Inside the Zhao apartment, the atmosphere was anything but brilliant. Lena had received her midterm school report the day before. Her grades were, as usual, mediocre. Her art teacher had appended a glowing note, but the other teacher's comments were a familiar refrain. Lacks focus, does not participate, needs to apply herself. Her father, Wei, had slapped the report down on the small kitchen table. Apply herself? She needs to live in the real world. What will this get her? He gestured dismissively at the sketchbook lying next to her untouched bowl of kanji. A job drawing? Ghosts? The argument that followed was short but sharp. It was the timeless battle between pragmatism and dreams, a conflict playing out in millions of homes. But for Lena, it felt deeply personal. Her mother, May, tried to mediate, but her father's frustration was a dam that had finally burst. "You will stay in your room and study today," he commanded. "No marsh, no drawing. You will read your history book until you can recite the dynasties backwards." Lena's face was a stony mask, but her knuckles were white where she gripped the edge of the table. She said nothing. She simply stood up, walked to her small room, and closed the door. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken anger. An hour later, May knocked on the door. "Lena, I've brought you some tea." There was no answer. She knocked again, louder this time. "Lena!" A knot of dread tightened in her stomach. Pushing the door open, she found the room empty. The history book was on the bed, unopened. The window, which overlooked a narrow alleyway, was slightly ajar. On her small desk, her newest sketchbook lay open. It was open to the last page she had been working on. The drawing was frantic, more so than her usual meticulous work. It depicted the reed marsh, but the perspective was skewed, as if she were looking up from the ground. Towering over everything was the faceless figure, the creature made of reeds. This time, however, it wasn't just standing there. One of its long, root-like hands was outstretched, as if in invitation or command. Lena was gone. She was wearing her favorite red padded jacket, a splash of vibrant color against the muted tones of the autumn landscape, and a pair of sturdy canvas shoes. She had taken nothing else. She had walked out of the city of bicycles and into the city of ghosts, leaving only a drawing of a monster behind. Part 2. The Drowning Search. The first few hours were a frantic illusion of control. May and Wei did what any parent would do. They checked with her friends, the few she had. They scoured the nearby streets, their calls of "Lena" growing more desperate with each passing minute. They told themselves she was just angry, that she was hiding in a nearby park or wandering the markets to spite them. She would come home when she got hungry, when the chill of the evening set in. But as afternoon bled into a bruised purple twilight, a cold, primal fear began to supplant their denial. This was different. The neighborhood, a tightly knit community where secrets were currency, mobilized. Doors opened. Worried faces appeared. The gossip network that usually traded in stories of infidelities and minor squabbles was repurposed into a search and rescue apparatus. People who had only ever known Lena as the quiet girl who sketched on the steps began fanning out, their flashlights cutting feeble beams into the deepening gloom. By nightfall, Zhao Wei, a man who prided himself on his stoicism, did the one thing that signified utter defeat. He went to the local police precinct. The man assigned to the case was Detective Wei. The shared surname was a strange, bitter irony that was not lost on him. Detective Wei was in his late 40s, a chain smoker with a perpetually weary expression, as if he carried the weight of every tragedy he'd ever witnessed in the lines around his eyes. He had seen the dark underbelly of Shanghai's transformation, the rise in petty crime, the desperation of migrant workers, the way the city's rapid expansion created cracks for people to fall through. He listened patiently to the father's story, his pen scratching notes onto a pad. A family argument, a runaway teenager. It was a depressingly common narrative. "She'll turn up," he said, his voice gravelly from too many cigarettes. "They always do. She's probably at a friend's house you don't know about, waiting for you to cool down." But then Lena's mother, May, her face pale and streaked with tears, pushed the sketchbook across the desk. Detective Wei picked it up,
his professional detachment momentarily faltering as he flipped through the pages. He saw the world through the girl's eyes, a world that was both beautiful and deeply unsettling. And then he reached the final drawing. He stared at the faceless figure, the Reed man, for a long time. The air in the stuffy office grew thick. This was not the doodle of a typical runaway. This was something else. This was obsession. This was fear. The marsh, May whispered, her voice cracking. She loved the marsh. Her grandmother, Nai, always warned her about it. The next morning, the search officially moved to the Reed Marsh. It was a logistical nightmare. The place was a natural fortress. 100 square miles of dense, 8-foot-tall reeds, winding waterways, and treacherous pockets of quicksand-like mud. The police organized a grid search, supplemented by dozens of volunteers from the neighborhood and Way's factory. They waded into the green and gold labyrinth, a line of men and women armed with long poles to probe the muddy ground ahead of them. The sound of their progress was an unnatural intrusion. The crackling of trampled reeds, the squelch of boots in mud, and their constant, hopeful calls of, "Lena, Zhao, Lena." The marsh answered with its own sounds, the mocking caw of a crow, the splash of a startled fish, and, most unnervingly, the constant sibilant whisper of the wind through the reeds. It sounded like secrets. It felt like the place was watching them, a vast living entity, resentful of their trespass. On the second day, they found something. Not Lina, but a sign of her. Half hidden in the mud, near a narrow, overgrown path, lay a single canvas shoe. It was hers. The sight of it sent a jolt of collective horror through the search party. It was proof she had been here. But the shoe's location told a grim story. It wasn't lost in a struggle. It seemed to have been simply pulled off, sucked into the thick, greedy mud. The search intensified. The police brought in a dog, a German shepherd that whined and balked at the edge of the densest thickets, refusing to go further. Divers were called to plumb the murky depths of the main waterway, their lights cutting cloudy green swaths through the water. They found nothing but submerged junk and tangled roots. Detective Way set up a command post in a tent at the edge of the marsh. He was a man of logic and procedure, and he attacked the case from every rational angle. He ran background checks on every known degenerate and transient in the district. He re-interviewed Lena's family, friends, and teachers, searching for any hint of a secret life, a hidden boyfriend, an online predator, though the internet was not yet a household concern. He interviewed the grandmother, Nai. The old woman sat in her darkened room, the air thick with the smell of herbal remedies. She didn't speak of suspects or evidence. She spoke of the Hule Jing, fox spirits that lure people to their doom, and of water ghosts, the Shuigui, who drown victims to take their place in the world. It wasn't a man who took her, she insisted, her eyes cloudy with cataracts and conviction. It was the marsh, the thing she drew. She saw its true face, and it called to her. The detective, a man who believed in evidence you could bag and tag, dismissed it as the ramblings of a grieving, superstitious mind. But later that night, as he stood alone, looking out over the dark expanse of reeds, the image of the drawing, the tall, faceless figure, returned to him. He felt an irrational chill crawl up his spine, a feeling he hadn't had since he was a child afraid of the dark. The break in the case, when it came, was not from the marsh. It was from the city. A witness came forward. A woman who lived in an apartment block overlooking a section of the marsh claimed she had seen something on the Saturday Lena disappeared. She had been watering her plants around noon when she saw a flash of red, a girl in a red jacket, walking along the far edge of the marsh, on a path that led deeper into the reeds, not out of them. The girl was not alone. Walking a few paces behind her was a man. The witness couldn't provide a clear description. He was tall and thin, she said, and he seemed to move with a strange loping gait. The distance was too great for details, but she remembered one odd thing. He seemed to blend in with the background, with the tall, swaying reeds. The tall, thin man became the central theory. The case shifted from a missing person to a probable abduction and homicide. The search in the marsh became more frantic, more grim. They were no longer looking for a lost girl. They were looking for a grave, but they found nothing. No body, no red jacket, no other shoe, no signs of a struggle. It was as if Zhao Lina and the tall, thin man had been erased from existence. The physical search was officially called off after 2 weeks. The marsh had won. It kept its secrets, and it kept the girl. For Detective Wei, the case became a personal ghost. He kept the file open on his desk long after his superiors told him to move on. He would stare at the photocopy of Lena's last drawing, the faceless reed man, and the witness's description of a tall, thin man who blended with the reeds. Logic dictated they were two separate things, a child's fantasy and a real-world predator. But in the quiet hours of the night, a more terrifying possibility slithered into his mind. What if they weren't separate? What if the witness hadn't seen a man following a girl, but a drawing that had stepped off the page and come to claim its artist? It was an insane thought, a professional heresy, but it clung to him like the marsh mud. The silence that followed the end of the search was profound. For the Zhao family, their apartment became a mausoleum. The father, Wei, retreated into a shell of guilt and silent work, his face aging a decade in a few months. The mother, Mei, would spend hours in Lena's empty room, holding the sketchbook, tracing the lines of the monsters her daughter had drawn, as if trying to learn their language, to understand where they had taken her child. The silence in their home was no longer just the absence of Lena's voice. It was an active, malevolent presence. It was the sound of a question that would never be answered. Part 3, The Legend of the Reed Man. Time is a relentless current. It smooths the sharp edges of grief into a dull, chronic ache. For the city of Shanghai, the disappearance of Zhao Lina became a fading memory, a brief, tragic headline buried under an avalanche of new construction, economic booms, and the ever-accelerating pace of modern life. The 1990s roared on, and the city transformed. The Reed Marsh, once a wild and feared expanse, began to shrink. Developers, armed with blueprints and bulldozers, saw not a place of mystery, but prime real estate. They drained the wetlands, flattened the terrain, and built sprawling complexes of soullessly identical apartment towers. But you cannot completely erase a place. You cannot pave over a memory. Pockets of the old marsh remained, stubborn and wild, clinging to the edges of the new developments like a repressed memory. And in these remaining patches of reeds, the story of Zhao Lina did not fade. It mutated. It shed the skin of a true crime case and grew into the flesh of a local legend. The official narrative? A young girl abducted and murdered by an unknown predator was too mundane, too unsatisfying to explain the sheer, baffling emptiness she left behind. The absence of a body demanded a more supernatural explanation. The story found its monster in the pages of Lena's own sketchbook. Children who lived in the new high-rises, whose parents had moved to the area long after 1991, began to tell stories. They didn't know the name Zhao Lina, but they knew the legend of the Reed Man. He was a boogeyman, born from a collective, inherited fear of the wild space their homes had conquered. They said he was a spirit of the marsh, angered by the city's encroachment.
He was tall and thin, woven from the reeds themselves, and he would stand motionless for hours, indistinguishable from the landscape, waiting. They whispered that he lured children who strayed too close to the remaining wetlands, calling to them in a voice that sounded like the wind. He didn't hurt them, the story went. He just took them. He pulled them into the marsh, into his world of mud and whispers, and they were never seen again.
The flash of a red jacket became a part of the mythology. Teenagers would dare each other to go to the edge of the reeds at dusk, looking for a glimpse of the girl in red, Lena's ghost, forever wandering the paths, searching for a way home. Some claimed to hear a girl crying. Others swore they saw a flicker of crimson deep within the swaying stalks, always just at the edge of their vision. It was a classic ghost story, but it was rooted in a real and terrible absence. Lena was no longer a person. She was a cautionary tale, a spectral guardian of a vanishing wilderness.
For the Zhao family, there was no such mythic comfort. There was only the grinding reality of before and after.
They stayed in the same Longtang apartment even as their neighborhood emptied out and was slated for demolition. To move would be to finally, truly leave her behind. Their home was a time capsule of 1991. Lena's room remained untouched. Her small desk, her books, the faint indentation on her pillow. May would clean it every week, dusting objects that hadn't been moved in years, a ritual of love and madness. The father, Wei, suffered a heart attack in 1998 and was forced into early retirement. He would sit for hours by the window, a hollowed-out man, staring in the direction of the place that had stolen his daughter. The grandmother, Nai, passed away a few years after the disappearance. On her deathbed, she was delirious, her mind drifting between the present and the spirit world she had always believed in. Her last coherent words, spoken to May, were, "Don't be sad. She's not alone. She is with the spirits of the marsh now. She is one of them. She is drawing the world between worlds." Detective Wei retired in 2005. The Zhao Lina case was the one great failure of his career, a cold case file that sat in the archives like a tombstone. It haunted him more than any solved murder. The killers he'd caught were just men, flawed, pathetic, understandable. But the void that swallowed Lena was something else. It defied logic. It defied the neat and tidy world of police work. In the winter of his retirement, he found himself drawn back to the area. It was almost unrecognizable. The place where he had set up his command post was now a parking garage for a gleaming shopping mall. But he found a small park that preserved a section of the old marsh. A wooden boardwalk had been built over a patch of reeds, with plaques explaining the local ecology. He stood on the boardwalk, an old man with a hacking cough, and looked down at the reeds. They were the same brittle gold as they had been that autumn, long ago. The wind moved through them, and for a moment he heard it. That same sibilant, whispering sound. It sounded like a name. Lena. He shook his head, blaming the cold and his own morbid imagination. As he turned to leave, his eyes caught on something. Tucked into the base of a dense cluster of reeds, just off the boardwalk, was a splash of color. Red. A tattered, faded piece of red fabric, snagged on a root, half buried in the mud. It could have been anything. A lost kite, a piece of trash, a discarded flag. It had probably been there for a week, not decades, but he stared at it, and the world seemed to fall away. He saw it all again. The frantic search, the father's broken face, the mother's desperate eyes, and the sketchbook open to the drawing of a faceless monster. The reed man, the girl. What really happened to Zhao Lina? The simplest answer is the most likely and the most brutal. She was the victim of a human monster, a tall, thin man who saw a vulnerable girl and seized his opportunity. He killed her and hid her body so well in the vast wilderness of the marsh that it was never found. Her body likely returned to the earth long ago, consumed by the same nature she had so loved to draw. But the silence she left behind allows for other, darker possibilities to take root. In the quietest corners of the night, one can imagine a different truth. One can imagine a lonely, gifted girl who saw something she wasn't supposed to see. A girl who drew a spirit of the land, gave it form, and was then called to join it. One can imagine her stepping off the path, leaving her shoe in the mud, and walking into the whispering corridors of the reeds, not in fear, but in recognition. Walking toward a tall, faceless figure with outstretched arms, leaving the world of bicycles and concrete behind, to become a part of the marsh's eternal, hungry secret. The story of Zhao Lina has no end. It simply trails off, like a path into an impenetrable thicket. It remains a question mark, a ghost story whispered on the wind, a testament to the terrifying truth that sometimes people don't just die, they vanish, and all we are left with is the sound of their silence. and the stories we tell to try and fill the void.
The Silence of the Cypress Trees, Part 1. The Man in the Quiet House. Ichihara is not a city that makes headlines. Nestled in the Chiba Prefecture, southeast of the neon-drenched canyons of Tokyo, it's a place of contrasts. Part of it hums with the industrial thrum of the Keio Industrial Zone, its refineries and factories breathing plumes of steam into the sky. But venture further inland, away from the coast, and the city softens. The landscape gives way to rolling hills, manicured golf courses, and quiet residential neighborhoods where life unfolds with a predictable, comforting rhythm. The air here smells of damp earth and cypress trees, and the loudest sound on a weeknight is often the distant rumble of a train. It was in one of these tranquil pockets of Ichihara that Gota Ogino had built his life. In 2013, at 58 years old, he was a man who embodied the very quietude of his surroundings. Neighbors knew him as Ogino-san, a figure of gentle respectability. He was a manager at a local construction and civil engineering firm, a job that required a sharp mind and a steady hand, but he carried none of the industry's grit and bluster into his personal life. To those who knew him, he was kind, almost to a fault. He was a man with a ready smile and a calm demeanor, someone who seemed to have navigated the currents of life without making waves or enemies. He lived alone. His children were grown, forging their own paths, and his house on the quiet street was his sanctuary. It was a typical Japanese home, neat and well-kept, a testament to a man who appreciated order. Inside, life followed a well-worn path. He would rise early, prepare for work, and return in the evening. His free time was his own, filled with simple pleasures. Perhaps he enjoyed a warm cup of sake while reading the newspaper or watching a baseball game on television. We can only imagine these small rituals, the building blocks of a life that seemed utterly, almost beautifully, ordinary. This very ordinariness is where the horror begins. Because in the fabric of a simple, predictable life, there are no threads that should lead to a violent end. There are no dark corners, no foreshadowing conflicts. There is only the steady, metronomic beat of one day following the next. For Gota Ogino, that beat was about to be silenced, replaced by a brutal, chaotic percussion that no one, least of all him, could have ever seen coming. The late summer of 2013 was thick with the oppressive humidity that Japan is known for. The cicadas, the relentless soundtrack of the season, shrieked from the trees, their buzzing a constant high-strung thrum that seemed to vibrate in your very bones. The air was heavy, promising a typhoon that was churning its way up the coast. It was the kind of weather that makes people close their windows, turn up the air conditioning, and retreat into the cool sanctuary of their homes. It was the kind of weather that muffles sound, that swallows secrets. On the evening of Monday, September 23rd, the weather was true to form. Gota Ogino, his workday finished, was last seen at a place as mundane as his life, a local convenience store. The ubiquitous kombini is a beacon of light and life in any Japanese neighborhood. Its fluorescent glow is a promise of a hot meal, a cold drink, a magazine, a moment of sterile, air-conditioned peace. Security cameras captured his image around 9 p.m. He was dressed in his work clothes. He bought a few items, a bento box for dinner, perhaps a drink. He was just another man running a simple errand at the end of a long day. There was nothing in his posture, nothing in his expression to suggest he was afraid. There was no one with him, no one lurking in the background. He paid, took his plastic bag, and walked out of the bright oasis of the store, back into the heavy, dark, cicada-filled night.
He walked toward his quiet house on his quiet street. He was walking home. But, in a way he could never know, he was walking toward the end of everything. He was walking into a trap that had somehow been set in the one place he should have been safest.
Part 2. The Intrusion. We can't know the exact sequence of events that followed. The killer, or killers, made sure of that. They left behind a vortex of violence, but no narrative. So we are left to piece it together from the silence, from the shadows, from the cold, hard facts the police would later uncover. Did Gota Ogino arrive home to find someone waiting? The front door showed no signs of forced entry. This is the first chilling detail, the first note of discord in the symphony of the crime. Did he know his killer? Did he open the door to a familiar face, a colleague, a supposed friend? Did he open it to a stranger with a plausible story, a lost delivery man, Someone asking for directions? Or was the door simply unlocked? A minor oversight on a humid night, an invitation that was never meant to be extended. Whatever the answer, the threshold was crossed. The sanctity of his home was violated. Imagine the scene. The house is quiet, save for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant drone of the cicadas outside. Ogino steps inside, perhaps setting his convenient store bag on the kitchen counter. He might have kicked off his shoes in the genkan, the entryway, as is customary. A lifetime of habit, a simple act of coming home. And then, the intrusion. Was it a voice from the living room that startled him? A shadow moving in his peripheral vision? The horror of the situation would have bloomed in an instant. The sudden realization that he was not alone. The shift from the mundane to the terrifying is a switch being flipped in the brain. A jolt of pure adrenaline and ice-cold dread. The struggle likely began immediately. This was not a quiet, stealthy murder. The scene that was left behind spoke of a frantic, brutal explosion of violence. But before the final, terrible act, there was control.
Adhesive tape. The kind you'd use for packing boxes. It's a household item, unremarkable and domestic. But in the hands of the intruder, it became a tool of subjugation. They bound Gota Ogino's hands. They bound his feet. He was rendered helpless, a prisoner in his own home. This detail is profoundly disturbing. It speaks to a certain coldness, a methodical approach. This wasn't just a moment of red-hot rage that erupted and then was over. There was a process. The act of binding a person takes time. It requires proximity. It requires the victim to be overpowered, to be terrified, to know that something awful is about to happen, and to be utterly powerless to stop it. What thoughts raced through Gota Ogino's mind in those minutes? Did he plead? Did he bargain? Did he think of his children? The house began to be torn apart. Drawers were yanked open, their contents spilled onto the floor. Closets were ransacked, clothes pulled from their hangers, papers were scattered. The search was chaotic, frenzied. It had all the hallmarks of a robbery. Someone was looking for something. Money, valuables. And then, the violence escalated into its final, fatal form. The weapon was never found, but the medical examiner would later determine it was a blunt object, something heavy, something hard. Perhaps it was an object brought by the killer, or perhaps it was something found within the house itself. A heavy vase, a tool, a piece of decorative metal. An item of Ogino's own life turned against him. The blows were repeated, focused on his head and face, with a savage intensity. It was an act of extreme, personal violence. This was not a single, clean strike to incapacitate. This was a brutal beating, an obliteration. It was an act of rage, of hate, or of a terrifying, inhuman panic. When it was over, there was silence. The chaotic sounds of the struggle, the ransacking, the final terrible act of murder. All of it was absorbed by the walls of the quiet house. Outside, the cicadas still sang their song. The humidity still hung in the air. On the quiet street in Nichihara, nothing seemed out of place. The house looked the same from the outside as it always had, but inside, it had become a tomb, a tableau of horror sealed in the humid September night. The killer, or killers, slipped back out into the darkness from which they came, leaving behind a dead man, a desecrated home, and a question that would echo for years to come. Part 3. The Discovery. Tuesday, September 24th, came and went. The sun rose, the cicadas quieted to a low hum, and the routines of Ichihara continued. At the construction firm, Gota Ogino's desk sat empty. A phone call to his house went unanswered. An anomaly, perhaps, but not yet a cause for alarm. Maybe he was ill, maybe he'd taken a personal day. But as the hours stretched into another day, a knot of anxiety began to tighten in the stomach of his son. It wasn't like his father to be unreachable. He was dependable, a man of routine. A single missed day at work without a call was strange. 2 days of silence was deeply unsettling. On Wednesday, September 25th, The anxiety had curdled into a cold, heavy dread. The son, whose name has been kept private to protect his family's grief, could wait no longer. He made the drive to his father's house in Ichihara. Every detail of that journey must now be seared into his memory like a brand. The familiar turn onto his father's street, the sight of the house looking so normal, so peaceful under the afternoon sun. He probably felt a flicker of hope, a sense that he was overreacting, that he would find his father inside, annoyed at the fuss, but perfectly fine. He parked and walked to the front door. He called out, "Dad? Otu-san?" Only silence answered. He tried the doorknob. It turned. Unlocked. The first wave of real fear must have hit him then. His father was meticulous about security. An unlocked door was not just unusual, it was wrong. It was a tear in the fabric of his father's predictable world. He pushed the door open and stepped into the Genkan. The air inside was still and stale. And there was a smell, faint at first, but cloying and metallic. The smell of something profoundly, biologically wrong. The house was unnaturally quiet. The slippers his father would have normally worn were askew. He called out again, his voice now tight with panic. He moved further into the house, from the entryway into the main living area, and that's when he saw it. The scene that greeted him was a nightmare made real. The room was in utter disarray, a maelstrom of overturned furniture and scattered belongings. It was a landscape of chaos. But his eyes would have been drawn, in a split second of horrifying comprehension, to the still figure on the floor. It was his father. He was on the floor, his body in an unnatural position. His hands and feet were bound with thick, ugly swaths of adhesive tape. His face was unrecognizable, a mask of brutalized flesh and dried blood. The world would have collapsed for the son in that moment. The sounds of the street outside, the sunlight filtering through the window, his own breathing, it all would have vanished, replaced by a roaring silence in his ears. The sight of his gentle, kind father, so horrifically violated, is a trauma from which a person can never truly recover. It's an image burned onto the inside of your eyelids, waiting for you every time you close your eyes. His next actions were a blur of shock and instinct. He stumbled back out of the house, gasping for air, his mind reeling. He fumbled for his phone, his fingers trembling, and dialed 110, the emergency number for the police. The call went out at approximately 1:50 p.m. on Wednesday, September 25th, a suspected homicide. In the quiet neighborhood, the first siren began to wail in the distance, a sound that signaled the end of the neighborhood's peace and the beginning of a long, frustrating, and ultimately fruitless search for justice. Part 4, the investigation. The arrival of the Chiba Prefectural Police shattered the tranquility of the street. Yellow tape was unspooled, creating a stark, clinical perimeter around the House of Horrors. Uniformed officers secured the scene, while forensics teams, clad in white Tyvek suits, prepared to enter the contamination zone. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains, their faces a mixture of fear and disbelief. Murder was something that happened on the news, in faraway cities. It wasn't supposed to happen here. Not to a man like Ojino-san. Inside, the investigators began the painstaking process of reading the story told by the crime scene. Every object, every footprint, every fiber was a potential word in a language they had to decipher. The first and most obvious theory was a robbery gone wrong. The house was thoroughly ransacked. This wasn't a neat professional job, it was a violent tearing apart of a man's private world. The motive seemed clear, a search for cash or valuables. But as detectives looked closer, inconsistencies began to emerge, complicating the simple narrative. While the house was in chaos, the search seemed inefficient. Some obvious places where valuables might be kept were disturbed, but others were left untouched. More confusingly, several items of value, electronics, some jewelry, had been left behind. A desperate thief, particularly one who had just committed a murder, would likely grab anything of worth. Why leave things? Was the killer interrupted? Or were they not looking for valuables at all? Was the ransacking a performance, a deliberate attempt to mislead the police
and make it look like a common burglary. Then there was the method of entry. No broken windows, no pried open doors. This pointed investigators in two terrifying directions. Either Gota Ogino knew his killer and let them in willingly, or he had simply forgotten to lock his door. A fatal mistake that allowed a predator to slip inside. The first possibility opened up a vast and complex investigation into Ogino's personal and professional life. The second suggested a crime of opportunity, a chilling reminder that sometimes horror doesn't need a reason, it just needs a chance. The autopsy confirmed the brutality the son had witnessed. The cause of death was blunt force trauma. Gota Ogino had been beaten to death. The coroner's report would have detailed multiple devastating injuries, primarily to the head, indicating a frenzied attack. The sheer number of blows suggested a powerful, overwhelming rage. It was overkill. This level of violence often points to a personal connection, an explosion of emotion between the killer and the victim. It felt less like a panicked robber and more like a personal execution.
The timeline was critical. Ogino was last seen alive at 9 p.m. on Monday the 23rd. He was found at 1:50 p.m. on Wednesday the 25th. The medical examiner would have provided an estimated time of death, likely placing the murder sometime late Monday night or in the early hours of Tuesday morning. This gave the police a window of roughly 36 to 48 hours, where the crime had gone undiscovered. Detectives fanned out, beginning the grueling work of interviewing everyone who knew Gota Ogino. They spoke to his family, his friends, his neighbors, and his colleagues at the construction firm. They were searching for a motive, for anyone who might have held a grudge against him. But the portrait that emerged was uniformly positive. Gota Ogino was described time and again as a kind, gentle, and fair man. He wasn't involved in disputes. He hadn't fired anyone recently under contentious circumstances. He didn't have financial problems or secret debts. He was, by all accounts, exactly who he appeared to be. A good man, living a quiet life. The lack of an obvious enemy was a major stumbling block. If this wasn't personal, then they were back to the theory of a random robbery. But the conflicting evidence at the scene wouldn't let that theory sit comfortably. The binding with tape, the focused brutality, the valuables left behind, it all felt wrong. The police poured enormous resources into the case. A special task force was established at the Ichihara police station. They canvassed the neighborhood, asking if anyone had seen or heard anything unusual on Monday night. A strange car, a person walking late at night, an argument, but the humid, heavy weather had kept people indoors. The drone of the cicadas and the sealed windows had created a perfect shield for the killer. No one had seen anything. No one had heard anything. The convenience store footage was analyzed frame by frame. Was anyone watching Ogino? Did anyone follow him out of the store? The tapes showed nothing suspicious. It was just an ordinary man on an ordinary night. The investigation was hitting a wall of silence. The crime scene had offered up its chaos, but few concrete clues. There was no foreign DNA, no fingerprints that didn't belong, no murder weapon. The killer had been vicious, but they had also been careful, or perhaps just lucky. They had vanished back into the fabric of society, leaving behind only a body and a set of baffling contradictions. Part 5. The lingering question. As weeks turned into months, and months into years, the case of Gota Ogino's murder grew cold. The initial flurry of activity slowed to a painstaking, frustrating crawl. The task force remained active, but leads were scarce. The case became a ghost haunting the Chiba Prefectural Police, a file on a desk, a set of photographs that refused to yield their secrets. With no arrests, the only thing left was speculation. The public, and the police themselves, were left to circle the same set of agonizing theories. Theory 1. The robbery gone wrong.
This remains the most straightforward explanation. A burglar or burglars, believing the house to be empty, or that Ogino was an easy target, entered through the unlocked door. Ogino surprised them, or fought back, and the confrontation escalated with terrifying speed. In a fit of panic, the intruder killed him, bound him to ensure he was dead or to buy time, and then fled after a hasty, incomplete search. This theory accounts for the ransacking and the unlocked door, but it struggles to explain the sheer brutality of the murder and the valuables left behind. A panicked thief is more likely to use just enough force to escape, not to bludgeon a man to death in such a personal, rage-fueled manner. Theory 2. The targeted attack disguised as a robbery. This is the more sinister and complex theory. In this scenario, the killer's primary motive was to murder Gota Ogino. The ransacking was pure theater, a deliberate staging designed to throw the police off the scent and point them toward a random act of violence. This would explain the brutality. It was personal. It would explain the inefficient search. The killer wasn't actually looking for anything. This theory, however, requires a motive, and that is precisely what the police could never find. If someone hated Gota Ogino enough to plan his murder, they hid that hatred perfectly. Was there a secret in his life? A business deal gone sour that no one knew about? A hidden relationship? A past transgression? The investigation turned up nothing. It's a terrifying thought, that a man could have an enemy so patient and so hidden that their existence is only revealed by the act of murder itself.
Theory 3. The thrill kill or a crime of opportunity. This is perhaps the most chilling possibility of all. The idea that a predator was simply roaming the quiet streets of Ichihara that night, looking for a victim. They may have tested doors until they found one unlocked. The motive in this case would not be robbery or personal revenge, but something far darker. The desire to inflict pain and exercise ultimate power over another human being. The binding and the extreme violence could be part of a horrifying ritual. This theory is terrifying because it means the killer had no connection to Ogino at all. He was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, behind the wrong door. It means the killer could be anyone, anywhere, and could strike again without reason or warning. The police have never officially endorsed one theory over the other. They are left with the evidence, and the evidence whispers conflicting stories. The binding with adhesive tape suggests a degree of planning and control, often seen in more organized crimes. The frenzied, brutal nature of the beating suggests a disorganized, emotional explosion. The killer was a contradiction, both methodical and chaotic, careful and sloppy. Epilogue: the echo in the silence. Today, more than a decade later, the murder of Gota Ogino remains one of Chiba Prefecture's most infamous unsolved cases. A reward of 3 million yen, about 20,000 USD, for information leading to an arrest still stands. His son, who has had to live with the image of what he found in that house for years, has made public appeals. His voice heavy with a grief that time cannot erase. He has pleaded for anyone with even the smallest piece of information to come forward, to give his family and his father's memory some semblance of peace.